Hello, and welcome to Good Grief, the podcast dedicated to demystifying and destigmatizing grief with compassion and humor. I'm Nikki. I'm an end-of-life doula and a grief coach in Columbus, Ohio. And today we're going to be talking about grief and addiction. This topic I chose for a myriad of reasons. It's one that's been kind of sitting on the back burner, but it's also one that's been a little close to home for me. And we'll get into that in a bit. But I stumbled across an article one day very recently, and I thought, dang it, I'm going to hit this one. I think it's time. The title of the article, it's from the whatisyourgrief.com website, and I will link it in the show notes. The title of the article is, I Did Not Kill My Husband. You can find this person that this article is about on Instagram at I Did Not Kill My Husband. So we're going to put that aside for just a second. That's your little hook to get you interested in my podcast in this episode. And we'll get back to that to find out why we're talking about not killing our spouses. Spoiler, it has nothing to do with killing our spouses. But anyway, so this, like I said, this is one of the subjects that's hit close to home for me. I've lost multiple people in my life because of addiction in one way or another. Out of respect of privacy, I'm not going to share any specific stories because I have not asked permission ahead of time, so I don't feel comfortable sharing anyone else's story without their permission. But I have lost people close to me to addiction, and it is awful in a lot of ways. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. The grief surrounding addiction, not only for the addict themselves, but also the people around them. Because let's face it, that's affecting everybody. Addiction does not only just affect the addict, it affects everyone around them. And even people they don't know. Anyway, we'll get to that. So before anything else, and I'll say this a few times in the episode, if you are struggling with addiction and you need help, there is a confidential hotline that is available 24/7, 365, and they can refer you to treatment, give you information for both individuals and families who have mental and or substance abuse disorders. Okay? And that phone number is 1-800-662-HELP, HELP, or 4357. So again, 800-622-4357. There's also an online treatment locator. If you just Google, substance abuse help, it'll come up. You can also send a text message. Send your zip code via text message to 435748, which is help, the number 4, letter U, help for you. Okay, now let's get on with it. So let's start with grief for the addict themselves. Now, a lot of times, I'm not going to say all the time, and every addiction case is different, right? Just like every grief is different. So everybody has different parameters surrounding their addiction. So we're not going to generalize. Please don't do that ever. That's not okay for anything, but for this too. Let's not generalize addictions and addicts because they're not all the same. But the addict themselves, a lot of times the addiction begins because of either some type of mental health crisis or some other crisis that's going on in their life. A lot of times mental illness plays a part in this. So just keep that in mind when we talk about addiction. A lot of times it's not just somebody saying one day, I'm going to start doing drugs or alcohol. That's not how this works. Okay? So just want to get that out here at the beginning. So, and sometimes people start addictions because of grief. They've lost somebody. Somebody has hurt them. There's some type of grief involved and they move towards, I've talked about that in previous episodes about if you need a glass of wine, have a glass of wine. But if this is a problem, don't do it. Turning to drugs or alcohol to work towards your grief is not a good idea. Okay? But it happens and sometimes it turns into an addiction. So now we have an addict who is working towards sobriety. Yay, that's wonderful. What often is not understood is that their grief is going to play a huge role in their recovery. What kind of grief is there? We're getting past an addiction. Yay, that's a good thing, right? Well, there's going to be grief involved with that. There's loss involved. And there's the obvious, they are losing whatever their addiction was. be it, painkillers, opioids, alcohol, hard drugs, whatever it is, they're losing that drug and the feeling it gave them, the escape they had that came along with the use of that drug. There's also loss of ritual. A lot of times there's a ritual in drug use. There's certain behaviors that happen. A lot of times I hear that when people quit smoking. A hard thing they have is, they would have a group of coworkers that would all go out at 2 p.m. to have a cigarette together. It was like a nice little social time, and it was a little ritual. And a lot of times that's a loss, right? And along with that, next thing, addict relationships. You might have a relationship you have with somebody just because of an addiction. And this doesn't have to be drugs and alcohol. There's gambling addictions, right? And there's sex addiction. So you might have partners involved with a sex addiction, okay? Obviously. And gambling addiction. Maybe you have that buddy, you go to the casino every weekend, and that turns into every day. And this is when it becomes a problem. So you have relationship times that are either developed or furthered because of an addiction. And when you decide to go into recovery and leave your addiction behind, you're leaving those people behind too. Unless they're coming with you on this journey, you can't keep them in your life. So that's a loss. It's a loss of a relationship, of a friend, a family member, wife, husband. There's also a loss of freedom when you become an addict. Not saying this is true of all addictions, but there's an avoidance of accountability and responsibility sometimes that comes with addiction. And you're losing that now, especially if it's a chemical addiction to a drug or an alcohol or, something like that. You might have to be monitored for a while. People are going to have to keep an eye on you. You might have to check in with people for a long time. And you lose that freedom of just being able to go wherever, whatever, and do whatever you want at any time. You need to be held accountable for yourself now. And so there's that loss of that freedom. A really interesting one I read about was loss of predictability. I will share very briefly, my prior marriage ended because of my ex-spouse's addiction issues. And part of the problem was the predictability of things. And it can become a cycle of beginning recovery, falling off the wagon, so to speak, feeling bad about things, beginning recovery, falling off the wagon, and it becomes predictable. And you know when these behaviors are happening. But you kind of know what to expect with their behavior when they're currently using their drug of choice as well. Then that predictability is all gone. It's thrown out the window. There's also grieving over the time lost. Time lost either during your addicted period or time lost during the recovery process, especially at the beginning. If you have such an intense addiction that you're in an inpatient facility, you're pulled away from your entire life for a period of time. But even if you're on your own, it's not just something you stop. It's a process, right? And it can take over a big part of your life, and you lose a lot of your time to that. So briefly, there is a big misconception there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding addiction and recovery, but there's a misconception out there that entering into a recovery process, there's like an immediate sense of relief and everything is great again. And that's not true. At least not always. It can be, but it is a process, and it is a process that continues on day after day after day after day, from day 1 to day 40 billion. I was just having a beautiful conversation with a friend of mine hi Marianne, she helps run karaoke in different places around town, and they had a weekly karaoke at the Dry Mill, which, if you're not from Columbus, there was a bar that opened up downtown that was a dry bar. It was a bar with non-alcoholic beverages, and it was such an amazing place for people who are alcoholics, that they could go and have that bar experience and sing karaoke and, have that whole thing without the alcohol, right? And she got to meet so many great people doing her karaoke there that were addicts. And a lot of times they would put their name in for their song, and they'd put their name and then a number after that, which is how many days sober they were. And I won't share her stories. That's not my place. And I don't know those people. It's not my place to share their stories, but there were some beautiful stories there of people who had a lot of hope. And it was great that, unfortunately, the dry mill closed. So if you're looking for it, I'm sorry. It's no longer open. But yeah, it is a process. And if you ask somebody, I know people that have been sober for a decade at this point, and they're sometimes longer. I have a good friend who has been sober for, probably coming up on 20 years or so. And that's amazing. And even they'll tell you, like, today I still have to think about it. It's not something that ever goes away. It's a daily struggle. So yeah, there is a sense of relief, but also not really. There can be a sense of dread and, ta-da, grief. Okay, so there's another article I read that was a summation of multiple research done, and there are links to the actual studies in this article, which I will link in the show notes so you can click away and follow the trail of all the links to the studies. But it was talking about grief and substance use and how grief and addiction are concepts that tend to be intertwined quite a bit. Most of them come from complicated grief, which we haven't gotten into that yet. I do have on my docket somewhere to do an episode on complicated or compound grief, which is just basically when you got a whole lot of different things all mixed together into a nice little soup of grief. But a lot of times that plays a role in both the beginning of an addiction or with addiction together. But something I found very interesting was that there was a study with patients at a treatment center in Spain trying to determine the presence of complicated grief, and found that it was more frequently present in drug-dependent patients versus their control group, non-addicted patients, and that the presence of complicated grief in the drug-addicted patients was 34.2% in comparison with only 5% to the control group. So complicated grief is all over when it comes to addiction, and a huge, huge, huge part of it. Like I said, I'll link this. I'm not going to go through the whole article because that would be boring, but it is very fascinating. Another point they brought up, they found in a study, was that bereaved children seem to be at an elevated risk for substance abuse later in their life. Specifically, or particularly, mostly children who had lost both parents or suffered losses of their parents between the ages of 6 and 18. Those people were much more likely developing a substance use disorder. So, yeah, grief makes people do crazy things. Not saying this is crazy, but anyway, again, I definitely recommend checking out this article. There's an interesting table at the very bottom of this article from the studies of the percentage of participants who experience certain situations at each time frame. Time frame being prior to their substance abuse, while abusing, and then upon entering recovery. And the situations are things like divorce of your parents, physical abuse, witnessing a crime or violence, loss of support, divorce, job loss. These are all griefs, right? Loss of relationships. It's very interesting to see some of these numbers. So I highly recommend taking a peek at that. One of the top percentages was financial issues. More so than, divorce or loss of a significant other, which I found incredibly interesting. So a lot of that is grief for the addict themselves. So what about the families and family members and other people around, the loved ones surrounding the addict that have griefs themselves because of this loss? Well, there's the obvious, you've lost. And this goes in a line a little bit with ambiguous grief that I talked about a couple episodes ago, where you've lost somebody who's still there. You have lost this person. They are not the person they were because there's this addiction now, and everything around them has changed. So we talked a little bit about that in that episode. But so there's that. There's also loss of, if it's a significant other, there might be a loss of income because they're not working anymore, or they're using all their money for whatever their addiction is, especially if it's a gambling addiction. There's a loss of financial stability. So all sorts of things like that. But the article I referenced at the very beginning of the episode, I Did Not Kill My Husband. This was incredibly fascinating to me because it was the story of Annie Parker, who is the person behind I Did Not Kill My Husband. She had lost her husband to alcoholism. Prior to that, she had pulled her family away from him. They had children together, and there was just a big disruption in their life because of her husband's addiction, and now he has died. So just kind of summing things up, she lost her husband. Even though their relationship was strained and not really present anymore, she still lost her husband. She lost the father to her kids. So she's suffering that grief alone. She also is now the mother of 2 boys who have lost their father. They had, in a way, lost him prior to this, but she is now a single mom of 2 children. But the hardest part of all of this is she became the victim of blame of his death. A lot of his family blamed her for his death because she wasn't, quote, there for him, and she wouldn't put up with his alcoholism. And he died because of that, is how they phrased it. And so now she has to defend herself through all of this. And that's where this whole concept came from of, I did not kill my husband. Because it was not her fault. But you have to, if you look at both sides, his family was obviously very distraught by the loss of him, right? And a lot of times when there's a sudden loss or a traumatic loss or a tragic loss, we're looking for blame. We want to blame somebody for this awful thing that happened. And it was easy for them to blame her. Like I said, I'm not going to share too much details because it's not really time or place, but I had to end my first marriage because of his addiction. And I'm sure he blamed me for a lot of his issues past that. And I don't even want to think about what he told his children. He has 4 children. So I had stepchildren. And honestly, that was the hardest part. That was a huge grief for me because we had partial custody of his youngest daughter. We had her every weekend and a big chunk of time in the summer and Wednesday evenings on occasion. And she was very much a part of my life as much as he was because she was there all the time, and she was such a beautiful girl and I loved her dearly. And I had to walk away from all that, and that left her behind too. Spoiler, she and I are connected again and we're very good friends. So good things do come of this. And we both understand what happened. She's an adult now and we both understand what happened there. But that was a huge grief for me, was not just losing, I lost my husband, right? But I also lost a stepdaughter. But yeah, so back to Annie here. It was hard. It was hard for her to be in such a awful place of suffering all these different griefs and then being blamed for her husband's death as well. But there's a lot of reasons people want to blame somebody. They may not understand addiction. And I don't fully understand it because I've never been an addict myself. I don't fully understand what it's like to be an addict. I understand a lot about it. I went to Al-Anon meetings for years and I've done a lot of research on this, but I've never been there. So I can't fully understand it. So I can't know what it's like for the addict completely. And even again, every addiction is different. Every person is different. The alcoholism is considered, it's called many times a family disease because it affects the whole family, right? That's something I always struggled with because there's that part of you that's like, I'm not the one that has the addiction, but you kind of are in a way because you're connected to them. That's another story for another day. But we also know we have no control. And when you feel out of control, you want to gain that back somehow. And you've lost somebody and you have no control that they're gone. So you want to place that blame. So now you've controlled the situation. Like, okay, they did it. It's their fault. Now this makes sense. I can piece all this together in my brain, which, looking in from the outside, we all know that's not the right thing to do, right? And it's easy for any of us to sit back and say what we would do in that situation, but you don't know. You don't know what you would do in that situation. None of us do, right? So yeah, that's about it. This is a bit of a heavier episode, so I'm sorry about that. I don't mean to be a downer. I like to try to keep things light when I can, but let's face it, we're talking about grief. And a lot of times, grief is sad. Yeah, so that's grief and addiction. I could obviously talk more on it, but I encourage you to, look into it a little bit. And if addiction is something, I'll say it again. If addiction is something you or somebody in your family is suffering, you could call for help at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Helpline, also known as SAMHSA, SAMHSA, SAMHSA. You can call their national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP or 1-800-662-4357. Okay? Okay. Did my due diligence. If you need help, please ask for it. All right. Now, without further ado, since we are completed with our topic, it is time for the Death Deck. Ta-da! All right. I'm going to shuffle up the death cards today. I had my death cafe today, and we brought out some of the questions from the death deck to get conversations going, and had some really cool conversations. Two of the questions that came up are ones I've done on the podcast before, so that's neat. Okay, enough. Ooh, okay. Here's an interesting one. After you are dead, will you know how you died? And this one has multiple choices. You can just answer that question as is, but A, yes, I'll have access to lots of information in the afterlife. B, no, I'll be in heaven or reincarnated, but I won't know about my own death. Or C, nope, just a whole lot of blackness. Well, that's a good one to ponder. So, personally, I always hesitate to share my own beliefs on the afterlife because I know a lot of people. It's a very touchy and personal subject, but I'm gonna go with C. I won't go into all the ins and outs of my beliefs with what happens after we die, but I would have to say that I don't think I'll know. Unless I'm aware of it while it's happening. I'm being attacked by a bear because I pet it. They're so cute. Then I'll probably know that I am dying at that time, but once you're dead, I don't think the concept even is there. So, because you are gone. But that's something to think about. What do you think? I'd be interested to hear what you think. Please let me know. You know how to reach me, NikkiTheDeathDoula.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, Nikki the Death Doula. Reach out to me. So yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you have had a great day, and I hope you have a lovely week. And remember, your grief is yours, your feelings are valid, and grief doesn't always have to suck. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening today. It really helps the algorithm so more people can find me. But if you'd like to find me elsewhere, I'm at NikkiTheDeathDoula.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram at NikkiTheDeathDoula. Please feel free to reach out to me there. And if you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/NikkiTheDeathDoula. As always, all the money I receive through my Patreon goes into a fund so that I can provide pro bono work to those who cannot afford my services. You'll also get access to bonus content and maybe even a shout out here on the podcast. Scripts, editing, sound design, production, literally everything is done by me, myself, just me. Except for the music. The music is Cheery Monday by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find license information at filmmusic.io/standard-license. And as always, a special shout out to my best friend and husband for continuing to support me along the way.